Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Building Mapping and Gap Filling Strategies to Accelerate Your Network Development. My name is Mary Ellen Kuntz. I lead the collaborative here at Rails to Trails Conservancy and will be moderating today's session. Today's webinar is hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy's TrailNation Collaborative. The TrailNation Collaborative is a nationwide peer learning community that brings together advocates, leaders, and professionals from across disciplines to work together to establish and accelerate connected trail and active transportation networks all across the country. To date, we have over 7,000 people signed up for the collaborative. The collaborative provides proven tools, methods, and resources, including the TrailNation Playbook. Combined with RTC's expertise and that of all of you, our network of partners across the country, we come together to find solutions to challenges and barriers, working to accelerate the development of connected trail systems in our communities. This opportunity is free and open for all. We welcome professionals and advocates in the trail and active transportation community, as well as all of the adjacent fields. This is our third session in our TrailNation Playbook in Action webinar series that we've revisited throughout the year. At the end of today's session, you'll be prompted to take a short survey. We appreciate if you took just a few moments to share your thoughts and feedback. With the launch of the TrailNation Collaborative earlier this year, we're also pleased to offer what we call the TrailNation Playbook, an online resource and guide for creating multi-use trails. The playbook curates case studies, effective practices, and tools as a resource for trail planners, municipalities, states, and regions that are seeking to advance their own regional trail network projects. This resource is based off of a decade of working with hundreds of partners across all 9 of the TrailNation projects to envision, plan, organize, fund, and activate trail networks. These TrailNation projects serve as a learning laboratory for understanding effective strategies to accelerate TrailNation trail network development. Through this work, 6 different elements emerged as critical to the process: project vision, coalition building, mapping and analytics, gap filling, investment strategies, and engagement. Many of you know that the process of developing a single trail, yet let alone an entire trail network, isn't linear, and no one-size-fits-all approach that can be easily replicated. While different communities and regions might have to take different approaches based on their unique circumstances, we are seeing these integrated elements as core to our success. This webinar is one in a series that will highlight all 6 elements of the playbook. These webinar discussions highlight the application and some of the tools that you'll find in the playbook, and will help paint a more detailed picture of how regions and coalitions are approaching this work. Today, we are joined by 4 incredible experts on mapping, analytics, and gap filling strategies laid out in the TrailNation Playbook. First is Derek Strout, RTC's own GIS specialist, who will join Kalli Krumpos, the Senior Organizing Manager at the Washington Area Bicyclists Association, to discuss mapping efforts for TrailNation's Capital Trails Coalition. Next up is Curtis Bridges, the Database and Active Transportation Planner for the Charlotte Regional Transportation Organization in North Carolina. And finally, we'll hear from Jordan Petrov, the Associate Planner for the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. With that, I'll hand it off to Derek.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. Hello, everyone. Thanks for your time and happy Giving Tuesday. So I'll be walking through some lessons learned from our work with the Capital Trails Coalition and some things to consider as you're mapping and analyzing your trail networks. If you're not familiar with the Capital Trails Network, it is centered in the District of Columbia and encompasses surrounding counties in Virginia and Maryland. The CTC was formed in 2015 by the Washington Area Bicyclists Association, Rails to Trails Conservancy, and the National Park Service. And the vision was something of an expansion on a concept known as the Bicycle Beltway that's been envisioned for decades. Today, the coalition includes more than 40 public and private organizations, as well as citizen volunteers. And as we'll see, having such a broad group of stakeholders has been critical to the development of this trail network map. In our TrailNation Playbook, mapping and analytics is the 3rd step after developing project vision, and building a coalition, as you just saw. So at this point, you've likely already identified your project area and convened the relevant local and regional stakeholders. So I'll just walk through each of these, and to respect time, I'll try to move quickly. So two main points I want to highlight here in developing your vision are: one, take time to assess your coalition with respect to mapping capabilities. Start thinking about what your teams can take on and what you might need to contract out. We worked closely with our regional MPO, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and we were fortunate to have amazing GIS professionals across our teams. And hopefully your work will never truly be finished. So think about how you'll keep all of these maps updated. And the second may be obvious, but begin to or continue defining the characteristics of the trails that will be part of your network. And you can see some basic considerations here. So something that's important to remember when we use the term data is that we've collected both spatial and non-spatial data. So in the case of the CTC, the analytics working group conducted a plan review that included 70 planning documents that contained both. The review took months, but really informed the needs of our trail collection meetings and really helped the coalition get a better sense of existing and planned trails in each jurisdiction. It's important also to note that our trails have been selected from existing plans that have already gone through an extensive public engagement process, but you could certainly have a coalition that plays a more active role in engaging your communities to put those lines on the map. Another key piece is actually taking time to sit down with those data stewards. And like we found with the CTC network, there were different groups working on similar trail projects that were able to identify ways they could work together. So the diagram you see here attempts to show that even within a single county or city, you may need to be prepared to engage several departments and GIS professionals to find the most authoritative trail data, and then work to standardize those underlying attributes. So as you form a comprehensive data set of the trails and projects in your area, known spines will be evident and important connectors and gaps will start to be visible. This is typically where the original criteria will be put to the test, and the more trails, the merrier on the ground, of course, but to keep the momentum going, it's important to revisit and refine those criteria while also staying true to the overall goals of a cohesive network so that you don't lose the impact of that original vision. And here you can see how the universe of trail data that we gather on the left there eventually was pared down into the Capital Trails network that we have today. So for refining the data, this includes the segment geometries, but just as importantly, the attributes behind them. Continue to find ways to improve connectivity, strengthen your network, continue meeting with data partners, and consider gathering feedback with interactive apps. Here's an example of an app we built for coalition partners that provides a user-friendly platform for adding points to flag segments that either need improvement or are suggested as additions or removals. So we found this to be an invaluable piece of our work in developing the CTC trail network and many other projects as well. You'll also notice that there isn't a dedicated analysis step in this process, and that's because you'll likely be analyzing your data in one way or another throughout the project. So from basic visualization and exploration, calculating statistics and modeling connectivity, it's all made possible by bringing this data together in one place. And one powerful way to use your network data is through walksheds or service areas like we've done here with the CTC network. This is showing which areas are within a half-mile walk or bike ride of existing and proposed segments of the network. And like most development processes, this one is iterative when you get to the last couple steps here. So continue to focus on maintaining clean, authoritative trail data. Take advantage of WebGIS platforms like Esri's ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise to build user-friendly maps and apps to showcase the vision, keeping in mind the audience and the purpose of the map. And don't be afraid to tell stories with your data. On the right is an incredible story map developed by WABA and the students in the Georgetown University's Masters in Urban and Regional Planning program that really brings the data to life. and uses the spatial data alongside really engaging multimedia and narrative to make a powerful argument for completing the network. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Kalli, who will talk about how this work leads into the gap filling strategy of the playbook.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Kalli Krumpos, she, her pronouns. As you heard, I'm the Senior Organizing Manager at the Washington Area Bicyclist Association, where I help manage the Capitol Trails Coalition. Derek got into some of the technical details about the coalition's mapping efforts. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about how we do the work around gap filling. So from the outset, I want to make it clear, I am not a data analyst, but I'm really excited how we use these tools to advance the goals of the coalition. A little bit more about the Capitol Trails Coalition. As you heard, coalition building is a core element of the TrailNation Playbook. Our coalition is made up of actually now more than 80 different organizations, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, community groups, and more who have come together with the goal of building out an equitably distributed world-class network of trails. We're currently at just over halfway to our goal of just over 1,000 miles of trails, and we're excited to continue building out that network. So you've heard about building out the network of trails. Here is just a simplified view of what that full network looks like, including the planned segments. As you heard a little bit, we're not going to go through all of these, but the process of building out the map included building specific criteria for what trails and which segments should be included in our network. I think something that has been really important to us as we build out our network and as we think about the advocacy work and community efforts around the network is a focus on equitably distributed trails. So as we are working to build out our network of more than 1,000 miles of trails, we center that equitably distributed focus in our work. So what does that mean? The criteria that we've used has three folds. The criteria requires that the trail intersects the boundary of high population density areas with low income communities of color that are also designated activity centers by our MPO, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, or MWCOG, where MWCOG recommends that growth be concentrated. Additionally, the CTC asked each of our member jurisdictions to submit their own top trail development priorities. The CTC then overlaid those two lists, and the end result was 40 featured trail projects, including 11 that fall into both categories. You can see here those trail priorities in dark green. Now, encourage folks to check out our interactive map, which is really helpful in setting that vision. This is a way to see how those trails connect and where those essential gap filling efforts are needed. The resources and recommendations on the TrailNation Playbook match many of the processes we followed, from establishing a shared vision, building out our coalition, to the mapping and analytics, and to the gap filling strategy. So today I want to spend a little bit more time just talking about a couple great successes that we've had on focusing our gap filling strategy. First one I'd really like to highlight is our close work with our MPO. Through the coalition's efforts in our mapping exercise, we feel very grateful and thankful for close collaboration, and are excited that we think our mapping exercise helped build buy-in from our MPO to get bought in on the vision of a regional trail network of trails. The CTC is excited that the trail network that we work on, the Capitol Trails Network, nearly exactly matches the National Capital Trail Network, which is the trail network of our MPO. It just expands a little bit further out into their broader footprint. So some key takeaways: MPOs are really important stakeholders, as we'll hear from many of our other speakers today. Another thing that we've done as we focus on equitably distributed trails and filling in those gaps is working really closely with our jurisdictions. So we have been going through a process to get a resolution passed in each of our core jurisdictions, committing to completing those priority trails and to completing the network. Something that we are really excited about just this year, a number of our core jurisdictions were successful in securing funding through a RAISE grant that will build out a number of different trail projects. The projects really highlight impressive collaboration between 3 different jurisdictions, Montgomery County and Prince George's County in Maryland, and the District of Columbia. So this, I think, is really important as we think about gap filling. Individually, each of these little projects doesn't look as impressive, but paired together, we're really able to see how we are approaching a network, both by rehabilitating some of the oldest trails in our region and also filling in some of those small gaps that really add impressive accessibility, safety improvements, and really address the need for equitably distributed trails. So here, just listed out some of those benefits that you all know so well about why building out the trails are so important. And finally, something else that we are continuing to think about as we look at each individual trail project is trying to think about where we can leverage the efforts of our coalition members and our community members to focus on filling gaps and building out additional trail projects throughout the trail development cycle.
Thank you so much for that, Derek and Kalli. It's always really exciting to see how this project has come together for us over many years and many iterations and deep collaboration across the board. With that, we'll turn it over to Curtis.
Yeah, thanks, Mary Ellen. All right, so if you'll go to that next slide, a bit about CRTPO for reference, the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization. We are over 1.5 million in population. We got 1,560 square miles in our planning area. We have 27 voting members, 24 municipalities, 3 counties, and 2 North Carolina DOT divisions in our planning area. So it's a big MPO. Next slide. Primarily what we do, our MPO role, is to prioritize and allocate funding to local, both municipal and county projects. Sounds like y'all are well aware of your MPO's role in delivering projects. We're very fortunate that we have very active member jurisdictions and the state DOT who manage projects, take the lead in both planning, design, and construction. So we tend to stick more to evaluating, prioritizing, and funding those local projects. So we submit projects through our state's STI process. That's the program that programs projects into our STIP. We also have a competitive application process for discretionary funds. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And we have recently taken on more of a leadership role in coordinating IIJA grant submittals. It seems like there's a new NOFO out, must be every other month. So that's been exciting for us. Next slide. So fill in the gaps. When we think about filling gaps and network development, for us that starts with our CTP, our Comprehensive Transportation Plan. Those are our existing and planned transportation network for all modes. We have mapped that complete network and maintained it in GIS with regular updates from our member jurisdictions. It's our key tool for identifying gaps in our active transportation network, and to a degree serves as a basis for advancing projects to our MCP, our MPO discretionary funds again, and then the same process for NCDOT for some of their complete streets improvements. So I mentioned our discretionary funds a couple of times. Those are funds that pass through, of course, through NCDOT and come to our MPO. For us, that's a combination of CMAQ, transportation alternatives, carbon reduction, which is a newer source, and then PL, planning funds. That discretionary process for us is a competitive process for our member jurisdictions. And we have developed criteria to score these active transportation projects. Those projects are scored based on connectivity, safety, feasibility, and health and environment, or equity. And I want to talk a little bit more about that equity piece. So in prioritizing equity, the first component of equity for us is social equity. And we've developed a methodology for evaluating projects for equity using demographics of the underlying census tracts. We call that our EJ, degree of impact. Those metrics include historically underrepresented communities, low-income households, and carless households. And credit to DVRPC up in Philadelphia. They created something very similar. We definitely use them as a model and inspiration. So good, excellent work by them many years ago. We do use that degree of impact for all sorts of equity work, specific, as well as specific criteria for our discretionary process. If you go to the next slide, the second equity component for us is health equity. And we're very fortunate, again, that we have some very passionate, knowledgeable staff in our Mecklenburg County Public Health Department. They have a seat on our CCC as well as our bike ped work group. They did some research in linking health outcomes to both income and education. And they identified some thresholds that allow us to score projects using GIS mapping based on their geography, which in this case is zip codes. And it's important because equity is increasingly a point of emphasis, certainly with IIJA and what we suspect with future federal grants. And so at the end of the day, we've identified gaps in the network and evaluated equity among other major criteria. So what does that look like in terms of funded projects? So last fall of 2022, we received 14 new active transportation project submittals for discretionary funding. We were able to fund 7 of those at a total cost of $14.6 million. That accounted for 25% of our total discretionary dollars for that round. And to put that in a little bit of perspective, I mentioned we submit projects to our state STI for the STIP process. Our state legislation limits our non-highway funding to roughly 4%, maybe 4 to 5% for non-highway projects. And that's not bike ped, that's all non-highway. That includes airport, transit, only 4 to 5%. So we typically are awarded through that process. We're typically awarded 1, maybe 2 projects if we're lucky, and that's every 2-year cycle. And again, we're the largest MPO in the state. So compare that to the 7 projects that we were able to fund through our discretionary process. That's really the largest source of advancing active transportation for our MPO. And we have a whole staff person dedicated just to our discretionary process and working with our NCDOT STIP unit, Jennifer Stafford here on our staff. So much credit to her for her work in that. In the next slide, looking back at, back to filling gaps. Safety is another essential component of that process. We do have GIS crash data for analysis at the MPO level, but I can't not mention efforts by our state DOT. They've invested a lot in developing vulnerable road user assessment data, and they've committed to maintaining that data. So you see here, look, we've got this shiny new GIS data and dashboard, which we can now use for our own analysis and project evaluation. And then finally, I have to talk a bit about, speak one more time, so filling gaps and completing our network. Now, we've developed an active transportation corridor tool, and this relies on a bunch of metrics from the regional top-down perspective, including safety, equity, and other metrics to help us identify regional corridors for investment. So that's a tool that we're implementing and again, pulls on several factors, including, again, safety and equity to evaluate those connections and complete the network. And I have to plug our SEAM, talking about regional corridors. We are working on a SEAM advancement study. If you're in North Carolina or certainly in the Charlotte region, this is formerly the Mooresville to Charlotte Trail, but it's a 50+ mile greenway. We'll one day connect one of our northernmost towns to the state line in South Carolina. We are stitching together, I know it's corny, but we're going to stitch together communities along that corridor. So please be on the lookout for that if you are in the area. Thank you. I'll go ahead and hand it back to Mary Ellen.
Thanks so much, Curtis. I always just really enjoy hearing about how all of those pieces of analytics come together and how you work with the communities to really understand what the communities look like and can prioritize accordingly. With that, we're going to hand it over to Jordan for our last presentation of today.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we've used different levels of spatial analysis at MORPC to inform priorities and decision-making around trails and gap filling in Central Ohio. So next slide, please. So for starters, a bit about MORPC. We are the Columbus Region's Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO. Our priorities include sustainability, active transportation, public health, safety. Next slide. And all the other benefits that a comprehensive regional trail network encompasses. So we work to advance this regional trail vision of over 500 additional trail miles across the Central Ohio region. Obviously, that's a lot, and it's going to take a lot of time to achieve. So the question then is, where do we start to have the biggest impact as soon as possible? Next slide. So I have some animations in the slide, so you can go ahead and click ahead 4 times to start. But the way we started to answer this question was with our regional trail vision prioritization study. And that looked to answer, with that we identified what is access to existing trails, access to proposed trails, the highest priority proposed trails, and then where need-based gaps in the trail network remained. Next slide. So first you see some the trail access sheds that we identified, and these route along pedestrian and bike friendly connections. Next, and using these access sheds and those ranking criteria from the last slide, we identified the highest ranking proposed trails, and the top 5 are highlighted there on the map. And since then, we've progressed on a lot of these regionally in terms of feasibility study, funding, land acquisition, and even construction in some places. So this analysis, we've seen this analysis inform local decision-making to some extent. Next. We also looked at first mile, last mile connectivity to trails, and we found that creating new connections to trails within a mile of each existing trail would nearly double overall access across the board. Next. And finally, we identified some recommended additional trails in those network gaps. And we found that these would more than double the number of high poverty neighborhoods connected by trails across the county. Next slide. So with all that said, implementation really happens at the local scale, particularly in terms of access to trails. So I'll go through a couple of local case studies, and I'm going to skip over this slide just in the interest of time, but I'll just mention these case studies I'll cover were completed as part of our technical assistance program. So the first one that we worked on was with the city of Columbus. So we took a closer look at a gap in our statewide Ohio to Erie Trail. Next. So that is highlighted there. You can see in the pink, that's the main gap in downtown. And then these are all of the potential corridors that we looked at as alternatives for completing that connection. So pretty much every potential corridor in the downtown area. Next slide. And we used a relatively simple buffer analysis to select demographic data, destination data, and roadway data within a quarter mile of each corridor. Then combined and normalized that data to produce these final composite scores that you see. Unsurprisingly, the major arterials, those emerged as the high scores. But what this analysis really gave us was some numbers to put to the approximate access that can be created by implementing these connections in terms of people, households, low-income folks, zero-core households, other data like that to characterize that access. And also very importantly, as you can see, we recommended shifting that alignment of the Ohio to Erie Trail through the heart of the city, which corresponded with some other planning efforts that were happening locally during that time. Next slide. Buffer analysis is great, but sometimes you need a more detailed understanding of local trail access. And for that, you need network analysis a lot of the time. So the focus of this analysis was looking at how we can better connect Grove City, our second largest suburb, to their nearest metro park and a developing north-south trail in that park. Next. So we started with a network comprised of the local multi-use paths and the low-speed, low-volume residential roadways to get their bike-friendly network. Next. From there, we identified what the gaps in that network are, and we looked at how much new access could be created to the park by filling each of those gaps. Next. So for starters, you can see what the existing network access is. And as you'd expect, it's really limited by the interstate, with just a little bit poking out west of the interstate via a multi-use path that runs underneath it. Next. So when we extend that path just a bit, you can see that the access expands quite extensively and reaches most of the community. Next. And when we extend that connection northward, we see that that access also expands to the relatively dense, lower incomes in the northern part of the community that are really important to connect to that park and to the trail in terms of equitable trail access. Next. And when we combine those two connections, you see that just two relatively short connections creates bikeable access to that metro park across most of the Grove City community. And again, these aren't unexpected findings, but it really helps us visualize how new connections can expand access to trails and how we can enumerate that access in really informative and powerful ways. Next slide. So I'll leave you with a couple of closing considerations. For one, which analysis to use really depends on the context and whether it calls for high sophistication or high ease of analysis, as well as what data is available. I'm a little biased, but I think MPOs are a great place to start in terms of determining that. And finally, a big part of what these analyses aim to approximate is what non-motorized data collection can concretely determine. And that's where people are walking and biking in reality. Next slide. So one of our biggest priorities at MORPC is building out our trail counting capacity and monitoring area. And to that end, we submitted an SS4A application to purchase enough permanent trail counters to help us achieve that. Our hope is that we can also use that ground truth data in combination with big data sources like Strava Metro or Streetlight to get an understanding of active transportation across our entire transportation system. Next slide. So with that, I just want to thank you all for listening in today. I know I went very quick, so please feel free to shoot me an email with any questions or comments. Also feel free, also looking forward to answering any questions you may have for me. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. I've learned so much today during the session, and I hope everyone on the call has as well. Just a couple quick reminders as we jump into Q&A. The Q&A box is still open, and we've got about 20 minutes for that. So we're making really good time today and have lots of time to answer your questions. And a final reminder that we have a few upcoming webinars that we'll put in the chat for you today, as well as a quick survey at the end of today's session. Those are really important feedback mechanisms for us as we continue and look forward to our 2024 webinar schedule that we'll be releasing in the coming months and helping us to know what is helpful for your body of work. With that, I'm going to start with a question we got for Derek, but I'd actually love to hear from all of you with your various expertise. The question was, how frequently do you recommend updating trail databases? And I'm curious if we could talk more broadly about the constant iteration and collaboration that you all have. Kalli, for you as an advocate, and Jordan and Curtis for you working with MPOs, it takes a lot of people to get trail networks built, and there's many people at the table. So I'm curious if we can talk a little bit about how that process works for you all.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a few different factors. I'd say it really depends on how often things are changing on the ground or in the plans in your area. Also depends on how you plan to use the data. If you're trying to host sort of an interactive public map, that you want it to be as accurate as possible. So you may be updating the data on a rolling basis. We have some projects that we update on a rolling basis like that as developments occur. We also have other projects that we've set up an actual update cycle. So we will collect feedback from our partners, like you saw in my bit of the presentation. We'll collect feedback throughout the year, but then we might have a specific update pattern. So twice a year, once a month, something like that. So I would say it depends on your capacity. Obviously, ideally, everything would be completely up to date all the time and automated. And the reality is it still takes humans to do that sort of stuff. So I would say it depends on how you're going to use the data and your capacity for that.
Yeah, I would echo everything Derek just said. I'll say that kind of an additional step for us, consideration for us, is that I mentioned our comprehensive transportation plan. That was tied for us very closely to which projects get submitted for funding down the road. So anytime a local municipality updates their local biped plan, they'll give it to us in GIS along with the actual document, and we will revise our CTP through our board meeting. We have a formal process, so those happen kind of as they come up, and we are constantly updating the CTP so that that network, kind of our default active transportation network, is represented up to date in that data set.
Jordan or Kalli, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'll just add that we update our regional trail vision on an annual basis. So we have a couple of committees housed within the Central Ohio Greenways, a board and a working group that kind of review proposed changes or proposed additions to the vision, and then vote whether to add them or change them, however. And then our trail database is really tied to that. So we also have meetings with communities, with portions of the region to identify what changes to the network are needed. And we also use those technical assistance studies to also take closer looks at portions of the network that need to change for feasibility reasons, or for, like that City of Columbus study that I mentioned, for just greater access.
Great, thank you.
And for the Capital Trails Coalition, we work with our jurisdictional partners, those government agencies, also on an annual basis to make sure that our maps accurately reflect the work that they're doing. I think for us, our priorities have stayed the same, but we want to make sure that we're continuing to check against each of those criteria.
And it's really important that's something I've been historically impressed with the Capital Trails Coalition, of having that constant iteration and making sure that both parties, like everybody's talking to each other and working towards the same goals, even if our local metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, their footprint's a little bit bigger than CTC's, but they've lined up really, really well. Okay, our next question is one I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on. Someone in our chat kindly pointed out that oftentimes our coalition work is really dependent on our government and agency partners. Kalli, can you talk a little bit about some of the skills and tools that we've used to develop really good partnerships with our government partners? And Jordan and Curtis, I'd be really curious to hear from your side of the table, what's worked really well for your local partners?
I think this continues to be a core question for how we get this work done as folks who are not out there actually building the trails ourselves. So I think we are trying to approach this at a couple different levels. One of the goals of the coalition is to provide a space where those different jurisdictions have a shared platform. So we can pull in the actual trail planners from Prince George's County, Montgomery County, DC, across Northern Virginia together in the same room. And I think that is really helpful so that folks can be thinking together, where can we collaborate around funding opportunities? Where can we work together around those priorities? But then I think kind of stepping back on more of the advocacy side, we are really focused on those priority trails and how are we involving our broad range of stakeholders, whether those are residents, whether those are from our membership organizations, businesses, community groups, business improvement districts, et cetera, trying to advance the data and research that we know to support these trails and bring that to those decision makers.
Yeah, I can chime in. I mentioned that we were fortunate earlier as an MPO. We truly are. Most of our member jurisdictions have staff who man our committees. All of our subcommittees are essentially manned by local staff. And so they participate in scoring projects, in reviewing lists, in every aspect of getting projects moved towards our MTP and then on towards our STIP for approval. So those partnerships are already kind of hardwired into our process. As far as our local jurisdictions go, we also have some trail partners, a couple nonprofits in the region who work closely with our staff. We have a Carolina Thread Trail is our regional trail network. It's a nonprofit. They've received several large donors to help flesh out a trail system in our region. And they are similarly involved in virtually everything that they do. They are guests at most of our, at least most of our active transportation meetings, and are very tied into what we do. So we're just fortunate that those partnerships are just kind of there, and we haven't had trouble fostering additional partnerships.
Yeah, and I'll echo what Curtis said. We also, our committees, our Central Ohio Greenways groups are made up of our local partners. And that prioritization study that I mentioned, the city of Columbus and Franklin County were key partners in that analysis as part of it. So they were involved in that. They're involved in the methodology and the process of the analysis. So having them kind of be part of that was really integral, and I'm kind of, having confidence in the results and using the results as part of their development strategy. And we've seen that play out in, those highest ranking trails that we identified in that study moving forward and implementation and really being priorities for Columbus and the county and other partners. So.
Thank you. I'd love to dig a little bit more into that prioritization process and developing that long-term strategy. We have a great question in the chat about what happens and how you work towards completing a trail network when there are a lot of stakeholders at the table in the Capital Trails Coalition. As Kalli mentioned, we've got the National Park Service, we've got DDOT, we've got all of the regional counties, we've got state players in the mix. And I know the same, maybe less so with the National Park Service in mid-Ohio and the Charlotte area, but there are a lot of stakeholders developing a lot of trails. So I'd love to think, and Derek, I'd love your thoughts on the data process for this as well. Love to think about how you really go through that prioritization process with so many stakeholders who have so many of their own individual priorities. We start with Kalli.
I think part of my answer is going to get back to the analytic side of things. As we are defining those priorities, a lot of us were thinking about where do we see the biggest impact? And I think as we have defined those priorities, we are really focused on where will trails make the most difference for community members. So really thinking about the equity impact, really thinking about safety, really thinking about access, and having those numbers can build a really strong case. So I think as we are looking at building out trails, getting those projects done, funding is a huge part of it. So I think having that strong story, being able to call back to the data is a really helpful tool as you're trying to convince those decision makers. Paired with that, you also need to be working with those community members to make sure that they are feeling very aware and bought in and involved in that process. And I think that's a place where those nonprofit groups, whether they are advocacy groups or just groups who are getting outside, can be really good partners in kind of bridging that gap between decision makers, between planners, and the groups who are in communities and would really benefit.
Thank you so much. Curtis or Jordan, do you have thoughts on that one?
Honestly, I would echo what Kalli said. Involve partners very early on in the process in developing the criteria even, and then stay focused on the data and the criteria, just be as objective as possible. And then when those local priorities advance to the point where you're trying to decide if they're going to get funded, you can look at those and weigh those local project submissions fairly against other submissions and come up with the most equitable, reasonable project selection based on the criteria.
Yeah, I'll third that, especially from our prioritization strategy, just including everybody as part of the analysis. And I'll also mention, some of those technical assistance studies I mentioned where we're kind of just working with one locality and it's not crossing jurisdictional lines, it's just a project in their CIP. Part of that is kind of just giving kind of identifying that information that they can use in their messaging or in their conversations with community members to be able to say, this is the expected impact of this connection. This is how many people, households, local residents will be connected by doing this project, and that's why it's important. Having that number and doing the analysis to come to that conclusion is really important information. I think we've also just we're kind of lucky to have a really great engineer's office in Franklin County, and they, oversee a lot of the kind of unincorporated jurisdiction that often is, sandwiched between municipalities and other jurisdictions. So they are a really great partner in working across those jurisdictional lines with us and with other municipalities to kind of bring things together.
I'll chime in on the data piece. Mary Ellen knows I'm not a planner, but yeah, I would just add to just identifying those GIS professionals across your partner network and just keeping communication open and being transparent about your process. And I feel like that's a pretty important piece for our work with Capital Trails Coalition. Just knowing the data stewards, having everybody on the same page, moving in the same direction.
Thank you all so much. Going off of that one, I'm curious, Derek, if you can talk about kind of some of the open source GIS software tools, maybe including AGO, that can be used for trail mapping. Some of those, like, not necessarily needed data specialist tools, but some of those tools that help get people in the direction to get started on this process.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. We're very fortunate to have licenses with Esri software, ArcGIS Online. I know that there are programs available if you are looking for funding for that. There's certainly open source platforms as well. This is just what we rely on. And I think, crowdsourcing of information has become pretty important these days. And it's nice to see that the democratization of data. And I think that really helps in relationship building. And I think not having data stored in silos like has in times past is great. And so I would say, depending on your capacity, the funding that you've got for tools, just explore some of the things that are out there. I think I mentioned a story map in my presentation. I think that's just one platform, one program that you could use to tell a data story, but also bring in some of the other expertise. You could bring in some quotes from people on the ground, your multimedia. So I love to dive into the data, but it's not just about points, lines, and polygons or attribute tables. Think of other ways that you can use that data to really sort of bring everybody to the table and tell the story around your project. I think the data can be key, but you have to find ways of telling that story. So there's lots of tools out there. I'm not a spokesperson for any one of them, but I hope that you can find some that can help your project.
Thanks so much, Derek. We've got another more data-centric question. I think this one's probably best for Curtis or Jordan, but open to thoughts from others. You both touched so much on different attributes that can play into this work. One of those that we didn't dive as deep into this time is on accessibility factors for infrastructure. So we had a great question in the chat about how you can work with local partners, or how local partners can work with MPOs and other regional planning and regional government bodies to get data on ADA asset attributes like slopes and measurements of curb ramps and tripping hazards and bus stops and all of those things. That is true for sidewalks as much as it is for trails. To understand that, to both understand the attributes and then the maintenance for them is really important as well. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays into your work?
Yeah, I can just mention, some of that data we luckily have. We have pretty comprehensive sidewalk inventory data, our transit inventory, our regional transit authority really keeps up on that. And we're thankful for, them kind of keeping that database going. In terms of ADA asset attributes, though, some of those more detailed, data points that were mentioned. We still have a long ways to go with that, and we really don't have comprehensive data for it at the regional scale at this point. I think when we do some of those local analyses, we can kind of take a look at that specific jurisdiction or that study area and get an understanding just from, looking at satellite imagery or what have you. But in terms of comprehensive data, yeah, there's a lot of work to do there. One thing that we're working to expand is our walk audit program regionally. So looking at specific areas, going on walks with local partners, regional partners, and kind of experiencing, the environment at the ground level. I think that data is important, but also having that lived in experience of walking the environment with decision makers, with local officials is really impactful.
Yeah, honestly, I was listening keenly to what Jordan was saying to see if he had any helpful ideas about getting those that ADA, getting those ADA assets and having it in a database. We don't have a complete database. We don't have broad access to that information. But we do have a transit operator in our area, CATS, Charlotte Area Transit System, and they have done more and more work in identifying curb ramps and things that are essential to ADA access. But as of now, I couldn't point you to a comprehensive data set or compilation of data.
Thank you both so much. I've gotten the opportunity to go on a few walking audits with our local planners, and they've been really insightful for me as well as our planners to just get a really great view over the planning process and how all of these, so many features are coming together. We do have a question about social equity and identifying community needs locally. They just asked if you can drill down on your approaches a little bit more. Curtis, I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about how you've approached, like maybe just the start of how that came up for the Charlotte MPO.
Well, we were actually kind of prodded, I think, by FHWA. I mean, this was back in, I want to say 2015 or 16. One of our FHWA reps kind of recommended that we enhance what we were doing with environmental justice and kind of the weight that we were giving to that analysis. Excuse me. And we took a look around. We found a great example again with DVRPC. They've done some good work in developing a methodology. So we kind of borrowed from that a little bit and tailored it to kind of suit our needs. So we've identified 7 communities, 5 racial and historically underserved communities, and then as well as Carlos households and I'll back on the other one, low-income households. So we've identified those and identified census tracts where the population of those communities is higher than the average population across our planning area. So where there are concentrations of those communities, and identify them, kind of quantify that, and then use that to measure projects and some other things that we do, some other studies that we do, but essentially measure where our linear projects and sometimes point projects kind of fall within that geography.
Thank you so much. That's really, really insightful. I think we've got time for one last question. This one's a little interesting, I think. How to specify a study to determine who owns the land in a trail corridor? How do you go through that process? Especially when talking about rail trails, they were usually only obtaining permission on private properties, which looks different, very different, depending on what part of the country you're in when the rail line was developed. So wondering if you can talk about kind of how you go through that process. That certainly plays a really big role in the project vision and the mapping process from the outset.
I can start on this. I think this is another case of us just having a very comprehensive kind of county auditor database. So at least our Franklin County auditor and several contiguous county auditors keep pretty comprehensive landowner and parcel data. So that's publicly available. And, we also have that as part of our kind of internal databases. And I think in terms of when we're planning or recommending trails that involve private properties and kind of the feasibility of that is unknown, I think our process generally is to recommend our local members after, going through that process of identifying that recommendation, going through engagement and analysis, whatever is identified as kind of the primary alignment. It's really important to get that into a local plan. And if it's a regionally significant facility, to get it into our regional plans as well, so that if that private property is developed, things change. It is within kind of local and regional codes. It is kind of required as part of that development. So we're kind of just positioning that trail, that alignment to be developed when, kind of the pieces come together. So I think that, that's kind of how we have worked on that.
Thank you so much. With that, I think we're coming to the close of this really great session. I want to take just another moment to thank all of our panelists for joining us today and for their contributions to ensure that we all have access to safe places to be outside. Our final Playbook in Action webinar is coming up in just a few weeks on December 13th, and will be focused on how to build an investment strategy. The registration link for that session is already in the chat and will be in the follow-up email sent out in a few days, along with a recording of today's session and a short survey for your feedback. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you have a great day.